In this video, I'll show you how to create a sticky footer in your layout. In web design, a sticky footer is a footer that sticks to the bottom of the page regardless of the amount of content on the page. Usually, if a page's content is shorter than the height of the browser, you end up with a footer that sits in the middle of the page instead of at the bottom where it belongs. Because of that, you sometimes get a big undesirable gap between the bottom of the viewport and the footer. This is a common problem you may come across when building a layout. Now, there are different methods for creating sticky footers with CSS. In this video, I'm going to cover a popular method that uses the CSS calc function and the viewport relative VH-unit. It's also a method that requires the least amount of CSS. First, in the HTML file, I'm going to add a new div that wraps the main header and container div. Now, this is another one of those instances where it's helpful to use a wrapper div in your layout. So right above the opening header tag, I'll add a div element and give it the class wrap. Then I'll add the closing div tag for this wrap div right above the opening footer tag. So notice how I'm not including the footer inside the new wrap div. I'm going to use the new wrapper to enforce the footer to stick to the bottom of the page with a little CSS. So inside the media query, in my style sheet, I'm going to create a new CSS rule that targets the class wrap. To force the footer to the bottom of the page, I'm going to use the min height property. Min height sets the minimum height an element can be. So I'm going to give it a minimum height of 100 VH. VH is a viewport relative unit. It stands for viewport height because it allows sizing purely based on the height of the browser viewport. Now, 1 VH is equal to 1/100th or 1% of the height of the viewport. So the value 100 VH means that the min height will be 100% of the viewport height. So when I save my style sheet and refresh the browser, we can see that it works. But it's pushing the footer down a little too far below the viewport, and I'm getting a vertical scroll bar. So if the page's content is shorter than the height of the browser, I want to stick the footer to the bottom of the viewport without seeing the scroll bar. The height of the footer is what's making the page scroll. Since I'm expanding the wrapper to the full height of the viewport, it's pushing the footer below the viewport area. So to fix this, if I open the Chrome Developer Tools and inspect the main footer element, I can see that the footer's total height is 89 pixels. Now, instead of trying to calculate a value equivalent to 100 VH minus 89 pixels, I'm going to use the CSS calc function to handle this tricky math for me. Calc is a CSS function that performs calculations and returns a result. With calc, you write simple mathematical expressions that add, subtract, multiply, and divide values. So back in my wrap rule, I'm going to replace the min height value of 100 VH with calc. So I'm going to type calc followed by a set of parentheses. Now inside the parentheses, I'm going to use a subtraction operator to write a mathematical expression that will subtract 89 pixels from 100 VH. So I'm going to type 100 VH minus 89 pixels. So the result of this calc expression is going to be used as the value for min height. So again, this is calculating 100% of the viewport height minus the footer height. So let's take a look at this in the browser. I'll save my style sheet, and when I refresh the browser, we can see that it worked. The scroll bar is now gone. So now the footer will always stick to the bottom of the page, no matter how little content there is on the page. This method works great if your footer has a fixed height. In later courses, you'll learn how to create a flexible sticky footer using more advanced CSS layout properties. You can also learn a whole lot more about the calc function and viewport relative units in the teacher's notes of this video. You've learned a lot of useful CSS layout tips and methods in this section of the course. I hope you're starting to get some ideas on how you can use some of these in your projects. In the next section, you'll learn all about CSS's block, inline, and inline block display modes.